So hi, so I just want to welcome you both, Finola Cronin and Paul White. It's great to be here with you in this virtual space, and great to see that you're both well. It was amazing. We had Paul over here in Limerick a few weeks before the lockdown, so you just got out in time for everything before it closed up. So amazing to see you're doing well there.
The Irish fairies didn't trap me in the
No,
land.
you just got out. I know, by the seat of your pants. And Finola, lovely to see you as well. I know the last time I think we might have met, I think it was definitely anyway around the Dublin Dance Festival last year when we had this conversation about archiving and with Valborn and Linda Murray and so it's lovely to be able to pick up this conversation with you again, even in different circumstances. I just wanted to really facilitate this conversation and because you in a way you have this you've only just met now online, but you have this kind of connection through a body of work and an experience of work, particularly working with Pina Bausch. And I found it really interesting that you've both embodied this work, but at different times, and also perhaps through different lenses as well. So with Finola, it might be through the development of particular creative pieces, and Paul maybe, but after Pina Bausch's death, so kind of entering into that environment without having kind of that encounter with her. So it's just, I suppose, interested to ask you both about that experience of the encounter with that repertoire and your sense of that. If maybe Finola, you might want to go first. Or...
Okay, yeah. It's a kind of a vast question in a way, I have to say, because I in terms of timelines, I got to Wuppertal at the end of 1984, and there was already a body of work there, and Pina had already begun the business of revisiting her repertoire year on year. Yeah. So up to a certain period, I think maybe about 1980, I think she was doing 2 new pieces a year. And then when I suppose the invitations for touring started to materialize, she really didn't have the time, I suppose, to make 2 new works. And plus it made sense then, it was an opportunity to revisit her repertoire. Mm-hmm. So when I got there, my initial work was learning, those big pieces of sort of Bluebeard and Rite of Spring and so on. And that was the first work. Yeah. And it was the following sort of September when the new season began that we began Victor, which was the first piece I made with her.
And so just to kind of build on that, so that process of encountering the work then as a kind of restaged work, how was that delivered? Was that something that you would have done with a series of other dancers or with her directly?
Yes. I came up, sort of so I would have auditioned in autumn, and I arrived there in January, not full time. I arrived because I was working with Vivian Newport in Frankfurt. So whenever I was free, I was asked to come up and start to learn the repertoire. And Pina was at that time making 2 Cigarettes in the Dark, what would become that work. And that was, it wasn't the full company who she was working with. Yeah. So I was working with cast, with the other company members who weren't in that cast, Beatrice Libonati in particular, and then Hans Popp, who was the teacher who'd been also a company member, who was usually responsible for teaching the boys. Yeah.
Oh yes,
Paul is remembering that.
We had some rehearsals for the Rite of Spring with Hans Popp.
Hans Popp, yeah.
That is a character. He's a strong man, that one.
He is, yeah. And my memory from that time, I spent 2 weeks learning Rite of Spring in the morning, and I did other stuff in the afternoon, maybe Arian or Contactor or something. And I literally crawled in there, did the rehearsals, crawled home, got into a bath, crawled back into rehearsals for 2 weeks because my body was completely, really felt sore. I would nearly say assaulted from these new contortions of movement that I had never met before. So I wasn't, at all versed in this Laban, Cortios, Hans Jülich, Jean Sebron. These are all these names that would have influenced Pina's aesthetic, and I wasn't familiar with this at all.
Yeah.
So that was it was a shock, you know.
Yeah. And Paul, for you then, so maybe it'd be really interesting to think about your first encounter, or how, you know, that maybe from a different lens as well, coming in.
Yeah. So actually, myself and another colleague, Scott Jennings, we were the first to join the company after Pina's death. Mm-hmm. And I think it was 4 years since she had died, and 6 years since the last company member joined. So there really was this sort of generational gap. Like 6 years is a long time. And I had never actually considered to be in the company. I had seen many shows from the audience and just loved that. You know, it was like, it was like going to the best movie picture possible. You know, I think the first piece I saw was Palermo in London. And it's including the break, I think it's around 3.5 hours long. And I just sat in my seat, including the interval, you know, and I was just completely absorbed in this beautiful fantasy world. So it was strange for me that I had never really considered, like, is this some company or some kind of style that you would like to get involved in? But when a friend of mine, Fernando Swells, who Finola would know, he sent me the company audition notice and said, like, how about now? You know, I thought, yeah, well, that's a very interesting era to join the company in. And so I went to the audition, and in Wuppertal, there were 160, I think, men. It was a men-only audition. And we began with the Rite of Spring. After a ballet class, we began with the Rite of Spring in 3 groups, you know. So it was like 50 men in each group, and everyone had their tops off, and everyone sort of like dancing for their life. And over the course of the weekend, I think we touched on about 10 different parts of her repertoire. And what was most interesting to me was actually how the company members were working together to pioneer something that without Pina. This was the first time they'd never held an audition without her. They had never held rehearsals, like self-managed rehearsals. It was all completely new for them. Mm-hmm. And from the dance floor, looking up to these 10 core company members who were making the decisions, I kind of got the sense like, this is really like a working family, you know? And families are not always functional or, you know, peaceful. So I could see, you know, there was really turmoil in how they worked with one another. But that was also then strangely okay. It was kind of like they were used to working with a sort of level of tension. And I think from what other company members said, I was quite lucky in how we entered the company. So we were there in 2012. And in the first year, I think I performed 9 or 10 different works, which, as Finola said, most people would come in and begin to learn small parts of repertoire and be in the new piece. And there was a lot of sitting and observing. So we really got bombarded with all these different styles, from things like the Rite of Spring, which is so visceral and intensely physical, to something like Kontakthof, which is more about a certain kind of posture and elegance and a certain sort of character, you know. So, and Finola, I have to say that Victor is one of my favorite pieces, and actually there's a stunning scene where Finola auctions off precious Gegenstände, precious objects, 4 of which are small little dogs. And when I performed in Victor, I got to be the auction man showing the dogs. Now, Finola wasn't in the role, unfortunately. Actually, replacing her was Cristiana Morganti, who is an Italian woman. Mm-hmm. And I thought this was an interesting little anecdote, Jenny, because she's trying to replicate Finola's beautiful, rounded, actually, I think you were doing it mostly in a British accent, Finola, at an auction speed, you know. So there's this Italian woman who's had to train herself to be able to auction in a British accent.
Christiana's terrific. Yeah, sorry, just to say, no, she's terrific and took over a lot of my roles actually. But she's a wonderful performer, and I think she gets the spirit of it, which is what it's about, you know. So
is that a Victor picture in the background?
It is.
And is that you, or is that?
That is.
Christiana?
Yeah.
Oh, great. That's the ballet mistress. No?
Yes.
Fantastic scene.
And so those relationships, I suppose, it's really interesting when you think of that then in relation to personalities, or, you know, the passing on of something or the embodying someone, like, so it's a role, but it's a person. And in the work, of course, these characters are so strong, you know, as however they're representing, you know, personalities, or it's very interesting to think about that. And how, maybe could both of you talk a bit about that? That's the sense of, you know, as you pass on something to another character, another person, how the kind of nuances shift, or even as you embody something from something you've seen or somebody you've seen. I'm not. It's might be difficult to contemplate that. Maybe you have an idea about that.
Well, my sense was, you know, I suppose in that first year, in those first few years, you know, I probably learned about 12 pieces, and we made 2 new pieces. So it was quite a, you know, huge sort of, and not just learned, but would have, you know, performed those works. So I suppose one of the terrific things that Pina would do is that she would have to recast, for example, sometimes might be maternity leave or somebody had left and so on. And you know, because there was a lot for me to learn, I was more or less replacing Nazareth Panadero, who had in turn replaced Meryl Tankard. So there was a lot of, you know, really lovely roles with lots of talking, which of course I just loved doing. But Pina's engagement with, this is not just my experience, but what I observed as well, was that, you know, she took the time out. You'd be held back after rehearsals for one-on-one talking through the role, doing little bits. Some things were never right, you felt, you know, you weren't quite getting what it should be. And you would, you know, you'd be there for another hour, you know, till 3:00 in the afternoon, and you'd have to come back at, you know, 5:30 to get ready for the evening show kind of thing. So a lot of it was, again, later when I began to study, you know, theatre studies, I realized that a lot of this was what you do anyway in when you take on a character. So very sort of Stanislavskian. So you'd be getting a whole kind of sense of maybe the backstory of a particular dancer's background and culture, you know. So she would go into, sorry, no,
just wondering, so that was part of that, you know, taking on the role, that she would give you that information. So
I suppose that's it, you know, particularly if it was in 1980 or even Contactoff or in Arian or Bogdonian, all of those pieces that were made at a particular time, or if you were taking on a role that had, you know, text in it, that was a scene that needed a particular texture, if you like, and atmosphere and delivery. You know, she really worked on that, you know, one-on-one. And then, of course, she worked on all the repertoire, you know, all the movement and so on. I kind of forgotten now what the question was, Jenny. I'm sorry, I sort of wandered on a bit there.
It was just to do with the kind of character. I mean, I suppose what's great is that sense of context, you know, because it's not just the movement, or it's not, you know, just the result of finding a way in. And it'd be great, Paul, for you to talk a bit about that experience, but from, again, in a different era when you didn't have the choreographer there, but you had dancers who remembered it. So.
Yeah, I think so the first piece I learned was Contactoff, and it was interesting. The company was stuck in New York with this big hurricane that was there. So my first week was Scott, myself, and Benedict Billet, who was there to teach us Contactoff, and which was probably quite good. So we had a week to learn the piece, you know, and mostly we began with the physical form, you know. And then the week after, the entire company arrived on the first day. They said, okay, well, let's just step through from the beginning. And all of a sudden, we noticed, oh, we're basically running this piece. You know, it was like, okay, catch up quick, you know. And just one funny memory that pops into mind, there was my partner in Contactoff, she had just had a baby. And I've never been anywhere before where in rehearsals, the woman is carrying a baby and breastfeeding as you're, elegantly escorting her downstage. I think the most difficult thing for the dancers, and at the time the directors were Robert and Dominique, I think the most difficult thing for them was to pinpoint or describe exactly what made the essence of a scene or the essence of a character spot on for them. And they would say, a lot of in the beginning they referred a lot to what Pina had said. Pina said this, or in the original, and there was this kind of a lot of referencing to the past. For instance, we'd start with a particular with the physical form, as I said, and it was almost like through the repetition of something, like Finola said, sometimes private rehearsals or just one move that was never enough. It's like ungefähr, which is like nearly or almost, and more breath and more line. And it was like in kind of what seemed many times as excessive repetition, parts that were not Pina or not that vocabulary seemed to fall away. There's that Michelangelo quote, I think, when he created David, that he chipped away everything that wasn't David. Mm. And that was actually my experience in learning the repertoire. Was, they'd say, okay, you walk from here, you say this, you do this movement, and then you exit. And we do that, and then it was like, oh no, that part doesn't belong to this, or that kind of character doesn't belong to this, or the intonation in your voice isn't it. Mm. And then actually we sort of got, I clocked on at one stage that when they stopped saying, no, that's not it, then maybe there was something right, Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So it's kind of, it's also interesting to think of that time, like the length of time something takes to settle, particularly to find, to locate yourself in it, where, something it can seem very, almost completely abstract, and how do I connect into this? And then at some point, did you, for both of you then, or the things that you do particularly to bring yourself into something like that, a role that wasn't created on you particularly, but that you somehow can find your own self in it? Or is that to do with time, or is it to do with information, or is it to do with your own processes of
there's many facets to that, and that's I suppose one of the things in sort of thinking about our discussion today was I realized that time is a key factor. And that sort of quite bureaucratic, subsidized kind of theatre, allows that kind of time be available. Mm. And I think that was probably the greatest gift, really, that I found, because I knew that I was struggling to find this vocabulary, this dance technique and aesthetic. But yet, Pina she's hugely patient, she was always, you felt, and I observed this with others who arrived into the company after I did, that she sort of take a chance, and she will wait for the dancer to get it, and she understands that takes time to be inscribed on your body if you haven't been used to that sort of aesthetic or technique, as we might call it, earlier or previously. So that, so it is about relentless practicing. Mm-hmm. It's about when I first went as well, and she might say, oh, I want you to look at such and such a role. So I might spend 4 hours even then watching a grainy video and a particular version of a particular piece that you can barely see, and then Pina would say, oh, I'm going to come and have a look at that video, and then she'd say, and do you see that now? She's coming in at that moment, and I'd like to. So she was in the business of recreating the work. I mean, she was fastidious anyway, but she was absolutely always questioning what she had created and looking again and again, as she's quoted as saying. And she would remember certain things. So she might say to whoever was managing the videos, as they were back in those days, oh, you know that video and so-and-so is in it, and there's a moment when that happens, I want to see that scene. And she would be trying to find that again, you know, remembering that all the works, bar very few, are big, you know, 3.5 hour, you know, opuses, opus, whatever the word is. And, you know, so this kind of, I think, tells us a lot about that attention to detail and patience, but above all about the time, you know, that's available to do that.
And how about for you, Paul, that moment of kind of somehow feeling like your own, or you're in it, or you can run with it?
It's interesting. I think it was less for me about arriving somewhere and more about being comfortable with never arriving somewhere in the piece, you know. So there were, you know, many tasks on stage that were actually impossible to complete, but it was the trying for it that makes that scene. So even in The Rite of Spring now, which is probably the piece that I've danced the most, and I'm no longer in the company, but I'm a guest in The Rite of Spring. Even that, it's like, you know, every time before going on, it's like, oh my God, am I going to break my leg? Will I be able to get through this show? You know, I don't know why, but I always have this thing, I'm going to break my femur, you know, and bleed out on the earth. So I think it's like becoming accustomed to that, being comfortable in the uncomfortability of it.
Yeah.
And then also being one of the repertoire dancers, not one of the creators, I noticed it was just as much a process for the people on the outside to accept a new body and a new flavor and a new interpretation. So there was also, for me, there was many times where I granted them patience in the studio, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's an adaptation. There's always going to be some adaptation. And I was also really interested to know then, you know, once you've kind of, even in that sense of it, maybe not settling into something solid, but it's still kind of fluid in that way. But is there a sense of how you carry those roles and that experience in your body now? You know, so the idea that you've taken them, you've inhabited them, and now do you have a sense of them, that you still carry them? Or
for me, it's impossible to get away with, to get away from, sorry. Yeah. You know, I think because of the repetition and because of the very specifics in the aesthetic, you know, it's now programmed into how I move or how I act on stage, even how I walk.
Yeah, I would concur with that, absolutely. I think, and also, you know, my whole sense of aesthetic has definitely been informed by that. So everything I look at and have looked at in the last decades is filtered at some level through the learning of being with Pina and listening to her and observing her approach to art in general, you know, not just to dance, but to, you know, and I suppose also as well her inclusivity in terms of people, you know, the kinds of places that she was interested, the way in which she was interested in different culture, and very conscious, I think, about class and society and economies and so on, you know. So I think all of that becomes, you know, it's something you sort of learn, you know, because as she's, you know, those famous quotes are actually ring very true in terms of, you know, not you know, what is it? Not what moves you, but yeah, what moves you rather than how you move. I mean, that's something that's been so bandied about, but it's hugely genuine, you know, that was it, I think, really, in the first instance, a kind of, as you say, perhaps, Paul, that idea of how you settle in, you know, it is as much about that. How are you going to be with everybody else, with that family, dysfunctional and functional? And I remember Vivian Newport saying, you know, but the important thing about the company was that on stage they were really strong. So it was all about the work. So even if off stage, clearly with big personalities, you know, which again, the longer I was there, I used to really enjoy observing how Pina managed that, you know, how she managed all of those egos, you know, and somehow, yeah, got the best out of everybody. But on stage, it was a very different story. It was all about the work, you know. It was always all about the work, but you possibly saw it manifested very clearly on stage, I think.
Yeah. And is there a sense of, you know, when Paul, when you say about that moving around with you now, is there a sense of that also things that I'm just trying to, not like a conflict, but is it something that you're trying to resolve, or is it something that's just become part of who you are? Because it's an interesting thing. Maybe it takes a long time sometimes when you encounter an approach and it really presents itself as a very strong kind of experience of way of moving, that there's also an element sometimes of maybe having to resolve that, and it still becomes a question, or is it just something that you feel has been integrated in, like, because when you say I can't get away from it, it was just interesting, you know, is there a sense of I would like to move through this and go?
Thank you for picking that up in my language, Jenny. No, I mean, I really appreciate it. There is kind of a suppleness, you know, and like extra length and breadth in what's available now in my movement. And there have been times where I've wanted to move in a particularly modern way, or a very kind of, you know, there's not a lot of very sharp, direct angles in Pina's work. It's kind of everything is, a lot of things are rounded and extended and breathy. And so I noticed it also altered my body, you know, like I got different form in my back and a different shape to my chest. And so it's not only programmed in the vocabulary, it's also in the body. So yeah, there have been times where I've thought like, I really wish I could have this physicality again. And then it takes really training to be able to have that kind of thing. But it's also, I think it's just such a stunning mix that she made and the company members made of different physicalities that it's for sure enriches performance as well.
Yeah. And I just wanted to ask you as well about what kind of, and this might be more general actually, maybe less only to do with Pina Bausch's work, but where you might see that you have left traces in works or choreographic kind of bodies of work. You know, do you? I mean, it's probably quite a hard thing to answer, so I know it's very abstract in a way, but you know, when you look at the works that you were in Finola, do you have a sense of the traces you've left, and for Paul, maybe for other works, like I was also thinking of Tanya's work, and you know, so would you be able even to say what those kind of traces might be, or what you think? It's not very you see yourself maybe is just broad when you look at
I don't know if I think there is, you know, there's been some writing now, there's so much scholarship on Pina's work now, it's extraordinary, but there's been some writing about if I stick with the Pina thing, because that was my last major sort of intervention or experience as a dancer, that the collaborative aspect of the work brings, you know, is a process of translation, I think, which is what has been written about. So it's that translation of your culture, arguably, because you're being asked about those questions, into a kind of a form, and then that becomes in some ways manipulated and embedded in the work and embodied by yourself in the first instance, and then others. So there's a way in which I think there are certain flavors, but whether or not they are then available to be understood as such as a whole other ball game. So I think there's one is one's own response and experience and feeling about the work, and the other then is, you know, is any of that perceptible to an audience? So in terms of traces, it's a tricky one. And when I went to visit the archive there a number of years ago, I was kind of very struck by this idea that there is just so much that I know about, or I think I know, or that I remember certainly about a particular period of the work. That is not general knowledge, if you know what I mean. So even the archivists who are trying to piece together things, I found myself saying, oh, that was so-and-so's role, and she wore that dress, and then she did this, and, you know, that sort of detail that was available to me because it was of a particular time. And so there's a sense that also, you know, in the same way, you know, the traces that, as I say, it's kind of the evidence for me, the traces that I feel I might have brought to this are probably all, you know, indiscernible now, and will not be uncovered, and it doesn't matter really. So yeah, that's kind of my sense of that.
Mm-hmm. And how about for you, Paul?
Well, just very briefly, in terms of Pina's work, often if we were learning a role, we would look at 4 different generations of that role. Yeah. So 3 or 4 different people, and kind of finding some sort of average or an accumulation of all of those different ways of performing that. And so obviously now, although you know, I was then recorded on stage performing roles, and there are people now learning the role, not purely from my performances, but it's also part of it now, you know. So there is, and Finola, many of the pieces you were saying, the dark videos, you know, many of the pieces also I learned, you know, studying a video for hours and writing down like walks 4 steps, you know, maybe from up, you know, it was like a lot of guessing. So maybe even that is now one of the traces of the new generation, is the things that got skipped and then, or missed, and how they filled up that gap, you know. So that then becomes the piece. In other areas, I noticed, so I live in Berlin, and I've been teaching at one professional studio here for a number of years. And it's interesting to see in the students that have come regularly over those years that they actually do move differently now. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if I gave a particular spiral movement, they do it much more fluidly and naturally, as if it's part of their movement now than they did years ago. And that's really satisfying as a teacher, to see that a pathway can be learned and taken on and embodied. And then you mentioned Tanya Liedtke. So she's a friend of mine who passed away, I think 13 years ago, dancer and choreographer. And our last evening was actually in Paris together watching Full Moon from Pina. And at the time, Tanya was already she'd just taken over the directorship of Sydney Dance Company. And Pina was like one row and 3 seats that way. I said, come on, you have to introduce yourself to her. You know? It's like, no! But yeah, in after her death, there's been a couple of times where I've remounted a work on Australian Dance Theatre, or small parts of works in the Hochschule für Musik und Darstellende Kunst in Frankfurt. And that's very interesting, because those works, they were very personal and they were made extremely collaboratively. You know, when I watch it, it's like, oh, that's me, like me as in the ego or personality or whatever. And so then to try and train someone to get that essence is a very peculiar thing. It's also very sort of a self-reflective process. Mm-hmm. But mostly I would say it comes down to really honing in on the physicalities with Tanya's work. We were very clear with each small scene or each part of each scene what the actual physicality was, you know, whether it was hard and sharp or intense or free and floaty and dreamy or slapstick. You know, there were all of these distinctions that we brought to the physicality that seemed to make a difference in the transmission of it.
Mm. And it's very interesting. There's I think Isabelle Launay, French scholar, wrote about saying that almost that the dancer only kind of knows what they're doing when they have to teach it on, when you have to gather it and figure out what it was, you know, only then does it almost really settle as something or kind of to you. So it's quite a process that
I think that was particularly true in Pina, because they had just performed and existed, and and then to turn the tables and go like, oh, okay, well, I think that what I'm doing is this, and this, and this. But then we would both look at the video, and it's like, oh, I'm really dancing a lot slower or a lot faster or in a very different way, So a lot of discovery for the teacher.
But that said, the other thing I was remembering this morning was that actually, when Bausch went back to look at her repertoire, there was an awful lot of time spent re-looking and remembering collectively, and on so many occasions, the mantra was, ich hab's immer so gemacht, somebody would say. I always did it like this. And then it might be a little bit of a pout, because actually now it looked like Pina wanted to change something, and Pina would just ride over that, and she would look at all sorts of different versions, we're talking like minute differences and variations, and then would be practicing and testing them herself, and then would sort of maybe sort of astonish some people and go with something that might have been a bit new, or might have placed an emphasis somewhere differently, so that sort of sense of revisiting was really a huge part of what was happening, so even in a work that might just be a year old, she would come back and look at that. And I have to say, at the beginning, that used to drive me absolutely nuts. It was like, good God almighty, how long do we have to spend, an hour looking at, 2 seconds of movement. So it really tested my patience, I have to say, Not that I didn't need to be also as paying as much attention, but I found that very hard going.
That sense of ownership, or kind of, when you're performing something that, when that's, you have such a strong memory, and it actually could also be incorrect sometimes. But it's powerfully strong that this is clear to me, and having to shift that or change that or brings up that kind of conflict. Mm-hmm. I remember, Paul, you were saying, I remember you said to me something about that the dancers would say, no, well, Pina said this to me, or she said, that was the same from the other side. It was like that, yeah. Brilliant. Okay, so look, I think we're going to have to end time-wise here, and we will also be able to have you for the Q&A panel, which you're really excited about. Yeah. Just going to close off the session. Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to talk to you both, and
thank you.
Look forward to talking to you in the panel.
Yes, thank
you. Good to meet you. Cool.
You too, Finola.